In 1965, Britain was the undisputed king of the waves, yet its ports were a rotting graveyard of Victorian inefficiency. While the world was moving toward the future in steel boxes, London's docks were held hostage by bureaucracy and radical unions. But one man decided that if the government wouldn't move the stones, he would bring the bulldozers. This isn't just the story of how the container won. It's the story of how a rebel shipowner destroyed the past to save the British economy. The mid-1960s in the United Kingdom represented a strange, paradoxical moment in maritime history. To the casual observer walking along the River Thames, the British maritime industry appeared as robust as ever. Thousands of ships clogged the waterways, and an army of nearly 60,000 dock workers swarmed the quays of London alone. But for those who understood the mechanics of global trade, the scene was a slow-motion disaster. The British port system was a Victorian relic operating in a jet-age world. The primary method of moving goods was still break bulk cargo. This meant that every single item, whether it was a crate of Scotch whisky, a sack of flour, or a heavy machine part, had to be handled individually by human hands. To understand the scale of the inefficiency, one must look at the technical bottleneck of the point of rest. In a break-bulk system, a ship would spend more time in port than at sea. A typical 10,000-ton cargo ship required 10 full days to be unloaded and reloaded. It was a logistical nightmare of hooks, nets, and physical sweat. Each gang of dockers had to manually stow items in the hold, ensuring that the ship's trim was balanced so it wouldn't capsize in the Atlantic swells. It was more of an art form than an industry, and it was an art form that was bankrupting the nation. The cost was astronomical. By 1965, the cargo handling costs in British ports accounted for nearly 30% of the total value of the goods being exported. For an island nation whose survival depended on export or die, this was a terminal diagnosis. While American ports were starting to experiment with Malcolm McLean's standardized 20-foot boxes, the British authorities, specifically the Port of London Authority and the National Dock Labour Board, were paralysed. They were trapped by a complex web of labour agreements known as the National Dock Labour Scheme. Established in 1947, this scheme was designed to protect workers from the hardships of casual labour, but by the mid-60s, it had become a rigid barrier to any form of mechanical progress. In London's East End, the docks were not just a workplace, they were a sovereign territory. The unions held such power that any mention of a pallet or a forklift could trigger a massive walkout. The workers feared, quite rightly, that automation would render their muscles obsolete. But while they fought to preserve the 19th century status quo, the geography of the Thames itself was conspiring against them. The traditional docks, like the St. Catherine docks and the Surrey commercial docks, were located far upriver. They were shallow, narrow, and constrained by the city's growing infrastructure. The new generation of ships, the massive deep-draft vessels required for economical container transport, couldn't even reach the gates. This was the but-therefore moment of British history. The government knew change was needed, but they were terrified of a general strike that could topple the economy. Therefore, they chose a path of managed decline, attempting to slowly modernize the existing docks through committee meetings and white papers. They were trying to fix a broken engine while the car was falling off a cliff. They didn't realize that the revolution wouldn't come from a government office in Whitehall or a union hall in Poplar. It would come from a neglected stretch of coastline in Suffolk, led by a man who had no interest in following the rules of the old guard. The narrative of British containerization is often told through the lens of large corporations like Overseas Containers Ltd., but the spark that actually lit the fire was an individual act of defiance. Enter Gordon Parker. Parker was not a traditional shipping tycoon in the sense of the P&O or Cunard elites. He was the owner of a small, largely ignored private port called Felixstowe. At the time, Felixstowe was little more than a silted-up basin with a few grain silos and a rusting pier. It was considered a Class B port, insignificant compared to the industrial titans of Liverpool, Hull, or London. However, Felixstowe had one massive advantage that London lacked. It was outside the primary jurisdiction of the National Dock Labour Scheme's most militant branches. Gordon Parker was a man of immense foresight and even greater stubbornness. He watched the developments in the United States, specifically the success of sea-land service, and he recognized a fundamental truth that the British government refused to acknowledge. You cannot put a container system into a break-bulk port. You have to build the port around the container. In 1966, while London was paralyzed by a catastrophic 42-day seamen's strike that saw Prime Minister Harold Wilson declare a state of emergency, Gordon Parker was busy. He began a massive dredging operation to deepen the approach to Felixstowe. This was his bulldozing moment. Without waiting for the massive state subsidies that larger ports were begging for, Parker invested in the future. He didn't just want to move boxes. He wanted to change the physics of the British coastline. Parker's gamble was based on a radical engineering concept, the dedicated container terminal. In London, they were trying to use old quay cranes to lift containers, a process that was slow and dangerous. Parker knew he needed a gantry crane. He contacted Pacheco, an American firm, and Vickers, the British engineering giant, to commission the first dedicated container crane in the country. This machine, the Pacheco-Vickers Portainer, was a monster of steel that could do the work of 100 men in a fraction of the time. The arrival of this crane in Felixstowe was a declaration of war against the status quo. It wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was a symbol of the rebel shipowner bypassing the gridlock of the Thames. Parker understood that the shipping cycle was changing. In the old world, the ship was the most important factor. In the new world, the system was the most important factor. The ship was merely a cog in a land-sea bridge. By building a terminal that could turn a ship around in less than 12 hours, Parker was offering something that London, with all its history and power, simply could not match: time. But the establishment didn't take him seriously at first. The experts in the British Ports Council laughed at the idea of a major shipping line diverting their vessels to a remote corner of Suffolk. They argued that the inland infrastructure, the roads and railways, couldn't support the volume. They were wrong. Parker knew that if he built the capacity, the volume would be forced to follow, because the economics of the container were so overwhelmingly superior that no shipping line could afford to ignore them. The rebel was not just a man with a crane. He was the man who realized that the old docks were not just obsolete, they were an active weight pulling the country down. To understand why Parker's move was so radical, one must delve into the sheer physics of the transition. The engineering of the box was not just about the container itself, but about the intermodal dream. In 1965, the concept of a through transport system was alien to British shores. If you were a manufacturer in Birmingham, you sent your goods by rail or lorry to a London warehouse. There, they were unloaded, sorted, and eventually moved to the quayside. It was a fragmented, broken chain. The container promised to turn the entire planet into a single, seamless conveyor belt. This required a level of precision that the old docks couldn't even conceptualize. Every container had to be tracked, every slot on the ship had to be accounted for in a stowage plan, and every crane movement had to be synchronized with the arrival of trucks at the gate. This was the birth of modern logistics, and it was being pioneered in a small Suffolk town, while the titans of the Thames were still arguing about tea breaks. By 1967, the pressure on the British government became unbearable. The McKinsey report had been published, and its findings were a slap in the face to the maritime establishment. It predicted that within a decade, 80% of the world's general cargo would be containerized. If Britain didn't adapt, it would be bypassed by the emerging ports of Rotterdam and Antwerp. The threat wasn't just theoretical, it was existential. Continental ports were already building massive Euroports, while Britain was still debating whether a container was technically a ship's tackle or shore equipment, a legal distinction that determined which union had the right to touch it. Parker's Felixstowe didn't care about these distinctions. He hired workers who were willing to be trained as technicians rather than just labourers. He paid them well, but he demanded flexibility. This was the bulldozing of the social contract of the docks. He was breaking the cycle of casual, uncertain work and replacing it with a high-tech, high-output industrial model. This shift in human capital was just as important as the steel cranes. It was the first time in British history that the port became a technology hub rather than a labour camp. The year 1968 marked the beginning of the end for the old docks. The giants of British shipping, P&O, Blue Star, British and Commonwealth and Furness Withy, finally realised that the era of the independent steamship was over. They formed OCL, Overseas Containers Limited, a consortium designed to pool resources and build a fleet of massive Bay-class container ships. These vessels were unlike anything seen before. They were the size of aircraft carriers, designed to carry 1,500 TEU, 20-foot equivalent units. But when the first of these ships, the Encounter Bay, was ready to sail, she had nowhere to go in London. The newly built container berth at Tilbury, London's last hope, was blacklisted by the unions. The workers refused to operate the terminal unless they were given a container bonus that would have made the entire operation unprofitable. The Encounter Bay was forced to divert to Rotterdam, and the British export industry watched in horror as their goods were transshipped from the Netherlands back to the UK on smaller feeder boats. It was a national humiliation, but Gordon Parker was watching from Felixstowe with a grim smile. He knew that the more London resisted, the more his rebel port grew. Shipping lines that had operated out of the Thames for 200 years began to quietly inquire about berthing slots in Suffolk. The bulldozing of the old docks had begun in earnest, but it wasn't a physical demolition yet. It was a demolition of the market. The volume of cargo at Felixstowe grew by 400% in just 3 years. The insignificant port was now the most important gateway in the country. This shift caused a tectonic collapse in the East End of London. As the big ships left, the ancillary businesses followed. The chandlers, the warehouses, the pubs, and the repair yards all found themselves without customers. The Thames was becoming a ghost river. By the late 60s, the Port of London Authority was forced to start closing the upriver docks. The St. Catherine docks, once the pride of the Victorian era, were the first to go. They were literally being abandoned. The government was left with a choice: subsidize a dying industry or allow the rebel model to take over. The engineering challenge of this era cannot be overstated. For the men who grew up in the 1940s and 50s, machinery was something you repaired with a wrench and a hammer, but the new container gantry cranes were early masterpieces of electrical and hydraulic integration. They were tall enough to clear the masts of the largest ships and had spreaders that could automatically lock onto the corners of a container using twist locks. This was a level of automation that felt like science fiction. In Felixstowe, these cranes were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In London, the old cranes sat idle, their gears rusting in the salty air. The transition was also a revolution in civil engineering. The apron of a container terminal, the area where the cranes move, had to be reinforced with massive concrete slabs to withstand the point loads of stacked containers. A stack of 4 high-density 40-foot containers weighs over 100 tons. The old wooden and brick quays of the Thames would have simply collapsed under that weight. Therefore, the bulldozing was literal in many cases. To make way for the future, the old world had to be leveled. Huge swathes of industrial London were cleared. The Victorian warehouses, with their beautiful masonry and intricate hoist systems, were seen as obstacles. They were torn down not out of malice, but out of a brutal economic necessity. To the man in his 50s today, this is a story of a lost world. You might remember your father or grandfather talking about the docks, about the smell of spices and tobacco that used to waft through Stepney and Bermondsey. That smell was replaced by the smell of diesel and the sound of pneumatic locks. It was a trade-off. We lost the romance of the sea, but we gained the ability to buy a car or a television at a fraction of the previous cost. To dive deeper into the technical mechanics of this transformation, we must examine the specific engineering of the ships themselves. The Bay-class vessels, such as the Flinders Bay and the Discovery Bay, represented a radical departure from naval architecture as it had been understood for centuries. Traditional ships had holds divided by decks, like floors in a building, to keep cargo from crushing itself. But a container ship was essentially a hollowed-out shell filled with cell guides. These were vertical steel rails that allowed containers to be slid into place with millimeter precision. If you were a marine engineer in 1969, seeing the inside of a container ship for the first time was like looking at a futuristic filing cabinet. There was no room for error. If a container was even an inch out of alignment, the cell guides would jam, and the entire loading operation would grind to a halt. This level of precision required a new kind of dock worker, a technician who understood tolerances and sensors, not just ropes and winches. In London, the unions fought this deprofessionalization of their traditional skills, but in the private docks of the East Coast, the workers embraced the new machinery. This was the rebel philosophy in action. Gordon Parker didn't just build a port, he built a culture of industrial agility. He fostered an environment where the man-hour per ton was the only metric that mattered. While London was still calculating how many sidesmen were needed for a bag of sugar, Felixstowe was calculating how many cycles per hour a gantry crane could complete. The difference was staggering. A ship that would have taken 108 hours to unload in the traditional West India docks was being cleared in 14 hours at Felixstowe. This was the economic bulldozer that flattened the competition. As we move into the early 1970s, the bulldozing took on a more literal and destructive tone. The Port of London Authority, facing bankruptcy, began the Great Rationalisation. This was a polite term for the wholesale destruction of communities. The Surrey commercial docks, which had handled timber for a century, were closed in 1970. The East India docks followed. These weren't just docks. They were entire ecosystems. When a dock closed, the local economy didn't just stumble, it vanished. The rebel ship owners had proved that the future was at the coast, and the government, finally realizing their mistake, began to divert all investment away from the city centre. This led to one of the most controversial periods in British urban history. Huge areas of the city became no-man's lands, vast expanses of mud, rusted metal, and decaying brick. For the man who grew up in post-war Britain, watching the heart of the empire be dismantled was a profound shock. It felt like the country was retreating from its own history. But Gordon Parker's success at Felixstowe provided a counter-narrative. It showed that Britain could still compete on a global stage if it was willing to shed its skin. Parker's port became the gateway for the consumer revolution of the 1970s. Everything that defined the modern British home, Japanese electronics, American appliances, European cars, came through the steel gates of those new container terminals. The rebel had enabled a standard of living that the old docks could never have supported. The technical evolution of the straddle carrier during this time also deserves attention. If the gantry crane was the arm of the port, the straddle carrier was the legs. These towering four-legged machines could drive over a container, lift it, and carry it across the yard. In 1965, moving a crate required a flatbed truck and a crane. By 1970, a single operator in a straddle carrier could reorganize 1,000 boxes in a single shift. This was the invisible architecture of the port. The layout of the quay had to be mathematically optimized for these machines. For our audience who values engineering, this was the transition from static warehousing to kinetic storage. The port was no longer a place where things sat. It was a place where things moved. The efficiency of the straddle carrier's path was the difference between profit and loss. Gordon Parker hired the best logistics minds to map out these paths, using early computer modeling that would have been laughed at in the union-dominated halls of London. Beyond the physical machines, we must discuss the bureaucratic bulldozer. In 1965, every shipment required a mountain of paperwork, bills of lading, manifests, customs declarations, all handwritten, all prone to error. The container revolution forced the creation of the combined transport document. This single piece of paper covered the entire journey from a factory in Ohio to a shop in Leeds. It was a legal engineering feat that matched the mechanical one. Gordon Parker worked with insurance underwriters and maritime lawyers to bypass the archaic general average laws that had governed shipping since the days of the Phoenicians. He was streamlining not just the docks, but the law itself. This is why the rebel title fits so well. He was attacking the entire structure of the British establishment, from the lowliest estivador to the highest judge in the Admiralty Court. The geopolitical impact of this transition was equally massive. In 1965, Britain's ports were designed for the imperial preference system, trade with the Commonwealth. This meant slow ships coming from Australia, New Zealand, and India. The container was a tool of the Atlantic world. It was built for the high-speed trade between the US and Europe. By embracing the container, the UK was effectively pivoting away from its empire and toward the emerging European economic community. Gordon Parker's Felixstowe was the physical manifestation of this pivot. Its location on the east coast made it the perfect gateway to Rotterdam. It was a bridge to Europe at a time when Britain was still struggling with its post-imperial identity. The bulldozer was clearing away the remnants of the Victorian Empire to make room for a modern European state. By the mid-1970s, the unit load revolution had reached its zenith. This was the moment when the intermodal concept truly matured. A container would be loaded in a factory in the American Midwest, moved by rail to the port of New York, shipped across the Atlantic to Felixstowe, and then delivered by truck to a warehouse in Manchester, all without the contents ever being touched by human hands. This was a level of chain reliability that the world had never seen. For the specialist audience, the key takeaway is the reduction of variables. In the old breakbulk days, every movement was a variable. The weather, the skill of the docker, the strength of the crate, the honesty of the tallyman. The container eliminated these variables. It turned shipping into a predictable, boring, and highly profitable science. Gordon Parker's Rebel Port was the laboratory where this science was perfected for the British market. He didn't just bulldoze the old docks, he standardized the British economy. He paved the way for the Big Bang of the 1980s, because without a high-speed, high-efficiency port system, the UK's transition into a service and consumer economy would have been impossible. The Rebel was the silent partner in the modernization of Britain. As we look at the modern landscape of the UK, the echoes of 1965 are everywhere. The massive automated cranes at London Gateway, the sprawling container yards of Liverpool too, and the endless train of liner trains carrying boxes across the country, all of these can be traced back to that moment when a single ship owner decided to ignore the no container ports mantra of 1965 and build his own future. It serves as a powerful reminder for the men of that generation, and for those who lead today. The most dangerous thing in industry is not a rebel with a bulldozer, but a traditionalist with a committee. The old docks were destroyed not by progress, but by their own inability to change. Gordon Parker merely provided the tool for the inevitable. The story of the British Container Revolution is a story of engineering, economics, and above all, the brutal necessity of the new over the old. It is the story of how a box made of steel and a man made of iron changed the face of an island nation forever. To further expand on the social cost, one must look at the grey zone of the mid-70s. As the old docks were bulldozed, they left behind massive urban voids. These voids were not immediately filled with glass towers. For nearly 15 years, the East End of London was a landscape of industrial decay. This was the price of Gordon Parker's victory. While Felixstowe thrived, the historic heart of London's trade became a wasteland. This period of structural unemployment defined a generation of British men. For those who had been trained to work the nets and hooks, there was no place in the new world of cell guides and twist locks. The tragedy of the container was that it was too efficient. It didn't just replace the horse and cart. It replaced the human being as the primary unit of logistics. This is a lesson that resonates today as we face the rise of artificial intelligence. The bulldozer of 1965 was mechanical. The bulldozer of today is digital, but the result is the same. The old docks must fall so that the new city can rise. The final engineering marvel of this era was the deep-sea hub strategy. Parker realized that Felixstowe shouldn't just be a destination, it should be a node. He pioneered the idea of feeder networks, where giant motherships from Asia or America would drop their loads at a single hub, and smaller vessels would distribute them across northern Europe. This required a level of berth management that was unprecedented. Computers were now essential. The Rebel was the first to realize that a port is not just land and water, it is information. The container is a physical packet of data. When Gordon Parker bulldozed the old docks, he was clearing the way for the information age. The legacy of 1965 is that it was the year Britain stopped moving things and started moving data. And as we look at the automated ports of 2024, where cranes move without drivers and gates open with facial recognition, we see the final form of Parker's vision. The Rebel won, and in winning, he made the world a much smaller, faster, and more efficient place. But as we walk through the quiet, luxury-lined streets of the old London docklands, we should remember the sound of the bulldozer and the man who dared to use it. The transition from the riverine economy to the coastal economy was the final structural change. For 1,000 years, London's power came from its river. The river brought the world to the city's doorstep. Gordon Parker's bulldozer broke that 1,000-year-old link. He proved that the city didn't need the port, and the port didn't need the city. By moving the docks to the coast, he separated the industrial from the urban. This allowed London to become a global financial hub, free from the noise, dirt, and labour unrest of the maritime trade. But it also meant that the city lost its grit. The Thames became a decoration rather than a machine. This is the ultimate if of British history. If the docks had stayed, would London be a more grounded, more equitable city, or would it have simply drowned in its own inefficiency? Parker made the choice for us. He chose the box, he chose the bulldozer, and in doing so, he chose the future. For the man who values progress and engineering, it was the only logical choice. But for the man who values history, it remains a moment of profound loss. 1965 was the year the tide went out on old London, and thanks to a rebel shipowner, it never came back in.